Democracy is built on ideals such as individual rights, freedom, equality, and the social contract. But a sensible person must admit that no democracy ever fully reaches the perfection of these ideals. But, in my view, even an imperfect approach to these ideals is better than the alternatives. So, if you live in a modern democracy as I do, or have ever even wondered about it, its ideals and history can be directly traced back to around 6 philosophers. For example, the writers of the US Constitution constantly thought, discussed, and wrote about 4 main philosophers. John Locke is by far the most important to the US Constitution, but Thomas Hobbes is a close second. 2 French philosophers, Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Baron de Montesquieu, are also quite important, and influential especially to the early French Constitution. So today we will look at 2 of these philosophers, Locke and Hobbes. If you would like to learn about the others, there are some excellent links below. Modern democracies did not and could not simply pop into existence. Most countries in the 17th and 18th century had some version of aristocracy, a rule by the nobility. And these kings and queens did not willingly give up their power. There were centuries of discussion, suppression, and of course violent revolutions before any of this could change. And the years before Hobbes wrote his influential work, The Leviathan, were some of the ugliest and most vicious in English history. Religious wars, political violence, and many massacres of civilians happened on both sides of the war. The ideal that supported this form of aristocratic government was called the divine right of kings, and sometimes queens. It was a deeply religious political idea. They believed that kings literally derived their power and authority from the will of God. Their ability to rule, make laws, and make war came from God and into the king. And it is here where Hobbes is most important. Before a social contract of equals could be even imagined, the divine right of kings had to go, or at least be weakened. Hobbes lived in this harsh time, and he made arguments that might sound harsh to modern ears. He begins with a brutally simple statement. Anyone can be killed. Even the strongest person can be overwhelmed by a group or killed in their sleep. And you can be sure he also meant that kings and other nobility can be killed just like anybody else. Our very weakness and frailty make us equal in an oddly human way. Kings and commoners are just human frailty when you get right down to it. And the so-called divine right is nothing but a power grab and cultural belief. Kings have no special outside source of divine right. This was and is a powerful argument. We are equal in our own human frailty. Hobbes wants to break down the social order so that he can then rebuild it. And he begins this rebuilding with his views on human nature. Not only are we equally frail, as he already said, we are usually selfish, fearful, and vainglorious, a beautiful old word that means that we always want to be seen in a positive light. Maybe, he says, there are a few exceptions, but at its base, humans are a messy, untrustworthy group. From this equality of ability and weak human nature, it follows for Hobbes that things will not be good when people clash over land, or really over anything at all. Nobody can be trusted at any time. This is not a pleasant description of human nature, but remember that Hobbes had a lot of evidence from his own lifetime and the recent history of England and the European continent. In his day, Protestants would simply massacre a Catholic village, men, women, and children. And the next day, Catholics might massacre a Protestant village, men, women, and children. Claimants to the throne would slaughter the other side, who was also claiming the throne. Both sides would argue divine right with their bloody spears and swords. It was, as Hobbes said, a war of all against all, where right and wrong were simply meaningless words. Everyone's lives were solitary, nasty, brutish, and short, as Hobbes famously said. It was so bad that anything would be better. Anything that would give peace would be better than this vicious existence. And it is here where Hobbes gives us his version of a social contract. The sovereign. Life is so horrible that we will give up nearly all our rights to an absolute sovereign, In return, we will get safety from the other nasty, brutish people. From our modern perspective, this might not seem like such a great trade, but remember that Hobbes has just destroyed the belief in divine right and replaced it with a social contract between equals. We may not get much from Hobbes, but it is us, you and me, not a so-called divine right king who gets to decide. Hobbes was an important and necessary step toward the ideals of democracy. He might be nowhere near a belief in democracy, but he did weaken divine right and create a space where equals created the government through a social contract. Locke was writing a generation later, and he did not fully agree with Hobbes on several points, as we will see, but he did benefit from this space that Hobbes created. One way to understand any philosopher is to understand their first premises, the underlying truths they take for granted and build their arguments on. I like to imagine two very different views of a state of nature. For Hobbes, it is a brutal, scarce, and constantly stressful state of nature, like an Arctic landscape. But Locke saw things differently. His underlying view on the state of nature is closer to a warm, plentiful desert island. Work is still required to live for Locke, but it is easier to live and not nearly as stressful. So as we go into Locke, remember these different first premises, and it will help explain their very different conclusions. Locke was not overly simplistic or naive, but he did think that an individual in a state of nature would be perfectly capable of supporting themselves. His state of nature is balanced, and it allows each person a space to be rational and to largely mind their own business. This individualistic ideal is one shared by many citizens of the United States today, and most of us are unaware of its source, and few wonder whether it is actually justified. From this less stressful beginning, much of Locke's argument follows. Unlike Hobbes' chaotic view, Locke believes the state of nature is governed by an obvious natural law, a law of reason. This law tells us that harming another is not only wrong, it is unnecessary. Why would, Locke asks, a rational person who has enough of everything hurt another person? It is simply wrong and unneeded. That other person can also understand the law of nature. They can reason just like you can. If you look at the quote from Locke here, you can see that he is explicitly attacking the ideas of Hobbes. For any rational person, there is a vast difference between a state of nature and a state of war. Let me repeat that Locke is no simplistic pacifist. He is well aware that war is a possibility, and he discusses it at length elsewhere. But war for him is a failure. It is not a constant fear. So Locke has a vastly different view of human nature than Hobbes. His is based on reason, and not only selfishness, fear, and vainglory. He also has a moderate view of the state of nature. So, when he builds his view of the social contract, he begins in a much different place. For him, the initial cause of the social contract is the creation of private property. And this is one of the reasons the authors of the U.S. Constitution copied, they literally copied, the ideas of Locke surrounding private property. At its base, his argument is quite simple. When a person mixes their labor with nature, this creates private property. So, if you find a fruit tree in the woods, prune it a bit, water it, then pick and eat the fruit, you have mixed your own labor with nature. And more importantly for Locke, you now own a tree. Of course, there's literally nowhere on Earth at any time in history where this simple mixture of labor and nature could happen without explicit or implicit violence. There's always a previous owner, to use Locke's phrase. But this did not matter much to the founders. It was the ideal, not the fact, that drew so many to this idea. And Locke finishes this with an often ignored exception to his own rule. It is certainly ignored in the contemporary democratic world. This rule is called the waste proviso, and as you can see in the quote to the side, it says that you can create property by mixing labor with nature, as long as, quote, there is enough and as good left in common for others. This rule limits how much you can take. Locke may have made an exception when he discusses coin creation later, but in any case, this idea is present in Locke but rarely appears in any modern capitalist democracies. So the progression from here is rather simple. When the growth of individual property leads to disagreement and conflict, the people create a, quote, civil society. This very limited form of government is largely in place to preserve private property and to manage the rules surrounding this property. There is some disagreement among scholars, but the basics are quite clear. Individuals, through their labor, create private property and only create a government when necessary to preserve the peaceful continuance of this property. And let me say, this idea was one of the most influential in the creation of the United States Constitution and several other countries' constitutions. The most important thing to take away from these two philosophers is that anyone living in a democracy is actually living in a world imagined and then created by these thinkers, and a few others we have not covered here. Many things we take for granted in a democracy, such as freedom, equality under law, rights, and property, are based on these ideas. It is far too easy to forget this. Just as this democracy was created in a couple hundred years, it can be destroyed just as quickly. Or worse yet, it can be taken for granted until it fades into meaningless slogans with no real substance. Democracy is a new idea on the scale of humanity, and it requires constant work to preserve it.